Good afternoon, nice to see you all. I hope you're staying safe and well. Welcome back to another video tutorial on the context of Jekyll and Hyde. In this video tutorial, which will probably span more than one part, we're going to be looking at the scientific advancements made in the Victorian era that inspired Gothic writers, but particularly Robert Louis Stevenson in his creation of the novella Jekyll and Hyde. We talked in previous lessons about how this is a period of great technological and scientific advancement. What I'm going to do, rather than give you a general overview of all of the advancements that were made in the Victorian period, is I'm going to pick out the relevant advancements for this novel. So I'm going to be talking about, just as a give you an indication, we're going to talk about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. We're going to be talking about Sigmund Freud and his theory of the unconscious mind. We're going to be talking about pseudoscientific progress as well. So we'll talk about hypnosis and Charcot in Paris and his demonstrations of hypnosis. So I'm going to give you an overview of the progress that was made in science and pseudoscience, but that's particularly relevant to the novel Jekyll and Hyde. So I won't be giving you an overview of everything that took place in the Victorian period, just what's relevant for this novel and the study of this novel. So I'm going to start with the most important scientific development of the century, and perhaps, depending on your views, of all time, and that is Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. I'll talk about what it is, I'll give you a general overview, and then I'm going to specifically talk about why it's important in relationship to the novel Jekyll and Hyde, what its importance is, and what Stevenson is doing when he makes references that are clearly to Charles Darwin's ideas. I think it's really important to have a very clear understanding of Darwinism and some of the ideas that he proposed before reading Jekyll and Hyde. So let's start with a quick overview of Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. See you shortly. Before we start and explore the impact and influence of science on the work of Robert Louis Stevenson in Jekyll and Hyde, it's worth pointing out the fundamental contradiction that sits at the heart of this novel. And that is the fact that this novel is ostensibly about the fear of science in the Victorian period. However, what the novel is also concerned with is the metaphysical, which means the beyond the physical, the idea of transcending reality, which is kind of the chief pursuit of Henry Jekyll. Jekyll professes over and over again in the novel how he's fascinated by the idea of escaping reality, going beyond the physical. And that's essentially what his experiment actually is. It's a metaphysical experiment. However, metaphysics is often really the pursuit of theologians and those involved in the study of religion. So at the heart of this novel is a contradiction between scientific rationalism, the scientific revolution brought on by the Enlightenment, and the belief in superstitious theological reasoning such as metaphysics. So it sits at the heart of the entire novel. Because although Jekyll is a scientist, the main character is a mad scientist figure. He is in fact a scientist that is obsessed with metaphysics and transcending his body and essentially reaching a spiritual happiness that he can't achieve in his current state. So there's a kind of religious nature to the novel that runs very closely alongside the scientific or the scientific exploration. It's worth also reminding ourselves that Jekyll actually discovers this potion that splits his personality more or less by accident. He adds a mysterious ingredient that he can never rediscover at the end of the novel. So it's not as if he's this amazing scientist who deliberately tests a hypothesis and finds out that he's been proved correct. He accidentally stumbles upon the forbidden knowledge, as it were, that allows him to split his personality. So it's worth reminding ourselves of the contradiction that runs throughout this novel between science and metaphysics. Let's now have a look at some of the scientific thinkers that influenced this novel. So Darwin is perhaps the most important scientist of this generation and possibly of all time. A brief summary of Darwin: he's a British naturalist and biologist. He grows to fame when he sails aboard the HMS Beagle in 1831, and he observes a range of animals on the Galapagos Islands. Galapagos Islands, obviously, in the clues in the name, are a series of islands off the coast. Well, I say off the coast, quite far off the coast of Ecuador, where there are different species of animals that are suited to different environments on different islands. And I'm just going to show you an image to kind of help me explain this. because I think it will make it clearer. So what Darwin noticed famously is he noticed that finches have different beaks on different islands, and he noticed this because and he made the observation that this is clearly about how the birds had adapted, and that's a key word, over millions of years to survive in different environments and different conditions, and this is what we call natural selection. So there have been very, very subtle changes in their in genes, but these are taking place over literally millions and millions of years for them to best survive in their environment. And this theory, like I said, became known as the theory of natural selection, or evolution by natural selection. Alongside that theory is the idea that individual organisms differ and that some variation is inherited. So the finches on certain islands would inherit the same beak as their parents, and these beaks might vary very, very slowly over time and evolve given what's happening on the island, given the resources available. He also proposed that organisms compete for limited resources. He noticed this on the Galapagos Islands, that there's competition amongst species. He noticed essentially what we would now call the struggle for survival, that the fittest species survive and reproduce more, and those that can't reproduce will die off. So we kind of explained how extinction happens, I suppose. And I suppose most importantly for our purposes, and I'll show you an image for this, but most importantly for our purposes is how this theory is applied to human beings. And what it implies, crucially for our purposes, is that species today descend from ancestral species, and they descend from slow modifications, slow adjustments, slow adaptations from ancient and ancestral species, including human beings. So on your screen here, you have this you see this kind of almost as a cliche now, the process of the gradual evolution of the human species. This is hugely important. I cannot emphasize how important this is. It terrified and horrified the Victorian public because it essentially, the theory challenged the creation myth that God created man in his own image. It challenged the idea that man was created separately from other animals, that man has dominion over the other animals. It essentially completely disputes Genesis, which is the opening book of the Bible, and the creation story, which involves man being given special dominion. So Darwin's theory confirms that man was in fact evolved from lower species, including apes. And of course, we have to remember that the Victorian period is a period of a general wide-held belief in the supremacy of the Aryan race of European civilization, and the belief very much in Christian scripture. So it really would have horrified the Christian population to discover that they are in fact descended from apes, descended from even forms even lower than apes. And what Darwin says, I've got a couple of quotes which I think are really important. The first one is that he believed that man can no longer believe that he is a separate act of creation. That's one of Darwin's proposals. And the second, which I think is a great quote, is that man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lower origins. So it's this idea that Darwin proposes you can still see, even in the modern man, in inverted commas, clues to his origins, clues to where we descended from. And this is a massively, massively, massively shocking and challenging idea. It completely disputes Christian theology, and it implies that we are all, as human beings, merely animals, which is again horrifying to the Victorians, who would have thought that they were superior to other animals. So Darwin's ideas are absolutely explosive. They are dynamite. And it must be emphasized that not all Victorians, and a large swathe of Victorians, challenge his ideas, challenge his assumption challenge his theory, and they don't, and they challenge it, and they claim that it's heretical, etc., etc. Just to quote a couple of works by Darwin, we've got The Origin of the Species, which is his most famous work of 1859. So this is something that Stevenson would be well aware of. It is a book that changed human history in a sense. The second book, which is more recent when Stevenson was writing, is The Descent of Man of 1871. And this is quite an important theory as well, quite an important book. And a great quote from this book is, I'll read it out for you. He said, "Humankind had descended from a hairy-tailed quadruped, which was itself probably derived from an ancient marsupial animal." And just to put that into modern English, what he means is that human beings are descended from hairy, tailed, four-legged creatures, and probably even derived from ancient marsupials. A marsupial is an animal with a pouch. So Darwin is clearly painting this portrait of human beings as being descended from apes, descended from even lower eras. And we have to remember that this caused great doubt in the Victorian population, who were, of course, prior to Darwin's ideas, extremely religious. And there's a great quote about the Victorian sense of religion, which is that they saw the hand of God in every act. And you can imagine that if you were someone who's that faithful and that religious, to have your faith questioned by such a radical theory would shake you to the very core. So really what Darwin does in his ideas is challenge institutional Christianity on a massive scale. And really science has always challenged superstition. But this is one of the core principles of Jekyll Hyde, the tension between the superstition and scientific advancement. And it's hard to tell, I think, in this novel, although it clearly is an allegory about the warning about the dangers of scientific progress. It's hard to tell where Stevenson sits, but clearly he has been influenced by Darwin's ideas. Going back to that book, The Descent of Man, Darwin proposes that just as man can evolve, there's a fear of degeneration that permeates the culture based on Darwin's ideas. So people kind of hear about evolution and then they realize that man could just as equally degenerate and devolve. So if you look at our image again, I'll just get it back for you. Essentially, the Victorians were fearful that man could go in the other direction, so go back towards being an ape-like creature, and they believed this could happen by breeding, essentially, and breeding with the wrong type of people. And we looked at deviance last lesson. So they believed that breeding with people who were foreign, breeding with people who are working class, breeding with criminals, breeding with prostitutes. They believed that if the impurities that could occur from that breeding could result in a degenerate species, a species that is going in the wrong direction, a species that is devolving. So Darwin is massively influential to this novel. There are so many references to Hyde being an ape-like creature. He's constantly referred to as being monkey-like, ape-like, and clearly Hyde is the animal within all of us. I think that's one of the most basic readings of this allegory, that Hyde represents the animal within all of us, the fact that we are all in fact animals, and our behavior is usually our behavior is usually formed by our culture and our environment. And what Stevenson explores in Jekyll and Hyde is the fact that culture is quite a thin veneer. It's like a facade or a mask. And if you scratch away at the culture, what you see is an animal beneath that, even in the case of a Victorian gentleman. So Stevenson is clearly influenced by Darwin's ideas, and Darwin's ideas are, like I said earlier, absolutely explosive. And this novel, I believe, really is an allegory about the fear of science, the fear of man being really descended from a lowly animal. Okay, we've reached a checkpoint. I would like you to spend at least 7 to 10 minutes on this task, and I'll see you shortly. Please follow the timings and write in full sentences. Welcome back. That's the end of part 1 of our series on the exploring the scientific influences behind the novel Jekyll and Hyde. In the next lesson, we'll be looking at Galvani, we'll be looking at John Hunter, we'll be looking at Charcot and others. So join me next time for the next tutorial on the scientific influences of Jekyll and Hyde. Stay safe and stay well. See you next time.